Here is something that will stay with you long after this video ends. There's a town in northern British Columbia where every lawn is freshly mowed, the bowling alley lights are on, and a grocery store still has prices on the shelves from 1982. Nobody lives there, nobody is allowed in, and someone is paying to keep it that way. Canada has 12 places like that. This is where they are. Stay until the end because number 1 is the most uncomfortable story on this list. Number 12. Bent's, Saskatchewan. The grain elevator is still standing. Everything else is a memory. Bent's was never a big town, fewer than 50 residents at its peak, the kind of prairie community that organized itself around the rhythm of harvest and the railway. The Canadian Pacific Railway ran the line that gave Bent's its reason to exist, and in 1977, the CPR abandoned that line and left. The last people to hold on were the Lawrence family, who ran the general store long after the population evaporated around them. When they finally closed the door, they did not clean it out. Inside that store today, vintage tins still line the shelves, price tags intact, merchandise waiting for customers who stopped coming decades ago. It is not a museum. Nobody decided to preserve it. It just never got emptied. That detail, a store frozen in time because it was simply too much trouble to clear out, says more about the speed of rural abandonment in Canada than any census figure could. And that is just the beginning of how this country hides its losses. The next entry was not abandoned by economics. It was erased by design. Number 11. Bankhead, Alberta. This is the one hidden inside a place 4 million tourists visit every year. Bankhead sits inside the boundaries of Banff National Park, roughly 3 kilometers from the town of Banff itself. Between 1903 and 1922, it was a working anthracite coal town with a population of roughly 1,000 people. The Canadian Pacific Railway operated the mine, and the community had everything: houses, a hotel, a skating rink, a company store. Then, the mine closed in 1922. And the government made a decision that tells you something about what national parks are actually for. They wanted a pristine wilderness image for tourists, so they physically demolished Bankhead, not left it, demolished it. What remains today are the stone foundations of the lamp house and the shell of one transformer building, designated A-level on the site map, which is a bureaucratic way of saying it survived because it was too solid to easily remove. 1,000 people lived here. What tourists walk past today looks like ancient ruins. It is barely 100 years old. A government erased a neighborhood to protect the view. Up next, a corporation erased an entire mountain town for a different reason entirely. Number 10. Mountain Park, Alberta. At 6,200 feet above sea level, it was once the highest altitude community in the British Commonwealth. Today, there is almost no physical evidence it existed. Mountain Park operated as a coal mining town in the Alberta Rockies from 1911 through 1950, when the mine closed. At its height, roughly 1,200 people lived here, including miners from more than 20 different countries: Poles, Italians, Ukrainians, Welsh. The elevation that isolated them also defined them. The wind up there does not stop. Even in summer, it has a cold edge to it. When the mine closed in 1950, the company that owned it, McLeod River Coal, made a swift calculation. They demolished the entire town site to avoid property taxes, not decommissioned, demolished. The only thing they could not bulldoze was the cemetery. It is still there, sitting in the mountain wind, holding the remains of miners from 24 nations who built their lives at an altitude most Canadians will never stand at. No town around it, just the graves and the elevation and the quiet that follows erasure. Number 9. Broughton, Nova Scotia. In 1905, a promoter named Thomas J. Brown stood on Cape Breton Island and told investors he was building a model city. He was not entirely lying. He just left out the part about the railway. Brown's company, the Cape Breton Coal, Iron and Railway Company, marketed Broughton as a sophisticated planned community that would house 10,000 residents and anchor a major coal export operation. They built quickly and with ambition. The centerpiece was the Broughton Arms Hotel, which featured what was documented as North America's first revolving door. Visitors called it the Palace in the Woods. That phrase tells you everything you need to know about the gap between what was promised and where it actually stood. The railway never came. Without rail links, the coal could not be moved. Without coal exports, there was no revenue. Without revenue, there was no town. By 1907, 2 years after construction began, the company was bankrupt and Broughton was finished. The palace in the woods rotted in the Cape Breton forest. The revolving door, installed to signal arrival, ended up marking a departure that came faster than anyone who bought into Brown's vision had imagined possible. A town built on a promise that was never structurally possible. The next entry is a town that was real, beloved, and abandoned in 48 hours. Number 8. Val-Jalbert, Quebec. In 1926, this was one of the most modern places to live in the entire province. Then, it had 2 days to disappear. The Ouiachuan River pulp mill at Val-Jalbert was the project of Damas Jalbert, who built not just a mill, but a company town designed to feel like a privilege to live in. Residents had electricity and running water decades before most of Quebec did. The convent school was stone, sturdy, built to last. The workers' houses were painted and maintained. By the standards of 1920, this was genuinely desirable. When the pulp mill closed in 1927, the 500 workers and their families were given 2 days' notice to leave. 2 days. The school is still standing, and it is one of the stranger experiences you can have in Canada. Walking through a perfectly preserved 1920s classroom, desks still in rows, in a town that has been abandoned for a century. Quebec eventually turned Val-Jalbert into a heritage site, which means the eeriness is now official. The buildings are maintained in their abandoned state. Frozen is the word that comes to mind. The next entry did not get frozen. It got swallowed. Number 7. Silver Islet, Ontario. In March of 1884, the coal ran out. That is the entire story of Silver Islet in one sentence. The mine had operated on a tiny rock outcropping in Lake Superior, so small that the original island was barely large enough for the shaft head frame. Engineers expanded it artificially, built a breakwater, and somehow convinced hundreds of workers to live on what amounted to a man-made rock in the most volatile freshwater lake in the world. At its peak, the Silver Islet mine was producing more silver per ton of ore than almost anywhere on Earth. Then, the supply ship carrying the winter's coal was delayed by ice. When the coal ran out, the pumps stopped. When the pumps stopped, Lake Superior came in. The shafts flooded. The richest silver mine in North America drowned in a week. Today, a small summer community exists on the islet. Cottages, a general store open a few months a year. But below the surface of the lake, the original shafts extend 1,200 feet down. The silver is still there. The water is also still there. If that entry felt isolated, the next one is even harder to reach. If these are the stories that interest you, subscribing takes one tap. We cover a different corner of Canada every week, and the top 6 entries on this list get considerably darker. Number 6. Butedale, British Columbia. You cannot drive there. You can only arrive by boat or float plane, which is part of why it still exists at all. Butedale sits on Princess Royal Island on the central BC coast, deep inside the Great Bear Rainforest, a region so remote that most Canadians could not point to it on a map. From the 1920s through the 1950s, it was a functioning salmon cannery, processing millions of fish annually and housing the workers who caught them. A massive waterfall powered the operation. The same waterfall is still running. It just powers nothing now. The sound of it fills the site constantly, this enormous natural force, indifferent to the cookhouse rotting beside it and the bunkhouses sinking into the moss. For years, a man named Corey Delves lived alone in Butedale as its self-appointed caretaker, trying to keep looters from stripping what the rainforest had not already claimed. One person standing between a place and its total erasure. The cedar and moss are winning. The buildings are returning to the coast at a pace you can almost measure year to year. Eventually, Butedale will not look abandoned. It will look like forest. The next entry became a ghost town, not over decades, but in a single night, and it happened in 2019. Number 5. Little Bay Islands, Newfoundland. On December 31, 2019, the provincial government cut the power to the island. That was the official end. Little Bay Islands was a fishing community off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, with a population that had been shrinking for decades. The provincial government's response was not to invest in the ferry service or the infrastructure. It was to offer residents money to leave, a buyout program formally called resettlement, but understood by everyone on the island for what it was. Most residents took the money. The ferry stopped running. The lights went out. Mike and Georgina Parsons refused the buyout. They stayed. And so you have the specific surreal situation of a couple living off-grid in a community of empty houses on an island with no ferry service in a town the government has administratively ceased to recognize as inhabited. Georgina Parsons described watching the other families leave, watching the houses go dark one by one, as something she could not fully put into words. She just stayed. A government-administered ghost town completed in 21st century Canada. Banff receives 4.3 million visitors a year. Little Bay Islands received a check and a deadline. Same country, same century. That disparity should bother you. The next entry involves radiation. Number 4. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. In 1982, 5,000 people lived here. Within months of the mine closing, it was nearly empty. Not slowly. Instantly. Uranium City sits in northern Saskatchewan on the edge of Lake Athabasca, as remote as it sounds. The El Dorado mine operated for decades, extracting uranium that fed both the post-war nuclear industry and, it is worth acknowledging plainly, the development of nuclear weapons programs. The town existed because the mine existed. When El Dorado Nuclear shut the operation in 1982, there was no backup plan. The regional hospital still sits there. The high school is still there. Inside both buildings, and this is the detail that does not leave you, medical equipment remains in the hospital. Textbooks sit in the classrooms, not as exhibits, just as things nobody got around to moving when the evacuation happened faster than anyone planned. A handful of people live in Uranium City today, roughly 80 at last count, in the shadow of radioactive tailings that have not been fully remediated. The contamination is documented, the cleanup timeline is not. What those remaining residents know about the ground beneath them is something most Canadians would prefer not to think about. The next entry is not toxic. It is something stranger. It is a city that exists only as pavement. Number 3. Gagnon, Quebec. If you drive to the coordinates where this city stood, you will find paved roads leading into forest, full boulevards, curb cuts, sewer access points, a grid of infrastructure designed for a city of 4,000 people, pressed into a landscape where no city has stood since 1985. Gagnon was a planned iron mining city in northern Quebec, built by a consortium of mining interests and fully functioning through the 1960s and 70s. At its height, it had 4,000 residents, apartment buildings, a cinema, a full municipal government. When the iron market collapsed, the decision was made to dissolve the municipality entirely. The Quebec government mandated that every building be demolished or relocated, not abandoned, removed. The intent was that Gagnon would cease to exist on the landscape, but the pavement was too expensive to remove, so they left it. What remains is genuinely one of the strangest places in Canada, a ghost infrastructure, a grid for a city that is not there. Former residents hold reunions in the forest, standing on the spots where their living rooms used to be. They bring photographs. They point at the empty air and say things like, "The kitchen was here," and "That was the front window." A city that was erased but left its skeleton behind. The next entry is a city that was not erased, it was bought. Number 2, Kitsault, British Columbia. The lights are on, the lawns are mowed, nobody is home. Kitsault was built in the early 1980s as a molybdenum mining town on the Portland Canal near the Alaska border. It was a complete community, housing, a recreation center, a bowling alley, a grocery store, built quickly for the workers and their families. By 1982, the mine had produced enough to justify the town. Then, the price of molybdenum collapsed on world markets, and the company shut it down. All 90 residents left within weeks. That was the last time a human being lived in Kitsault. In 2005, an entrepreneur named Krishnan Suthantharan bought the entire town for $5.7 million. He hired a small maintenance crew. They mow the lawns. They keep the utilities running. They maintain the bowling alley. The grocery store still has price stickers from the 1980s on some of the shelves. Suthantharan has described plans for the town over the years, a conference center, an arts retreat. But as of today, the primary thing Kitsault is doing is existing, in perfect, guarded, privately maintained stasis. You cannot go there. The town is private property, and the access road is controlled. There are no tours. The most perfectly preserved ghost town in Canada is also the most deliberately hidden. The final entry is not a mining town, and the people it displaced are still waiting to go home. Number 1. Dauphin River and Lake St. Martin, Manitoba. This is the entry that should be impossible to explain. In 2011, Winnipeg flooded. The provincial government, facing a choice about where to divert excess water to protect the city, made a calculated decision. They opened a control structure that directed floodwater toward several First Nations communities in the Interlake region, Dauphin River First Nation and Lake St. Martin First Nation among them. The communities flooded, the homes were destroyed, the residents were evacuated and moved into temporary housing. That was in 2011. As of the mid-2020s, many of those residents are still in temporary housing. The communities themselves sit in a state of permanent emergency. Buildings mold-blackened, interiors warped by water that was diverted there by government decision, toys still visible through broken windows of houses that have not been entered in years. The phrase temporary housing does not convey what it means to live in it for over a decade. Elder community members have described losing the connection to their land, to specific fishing spots, to burial grounds, to places that do not translate into a hotel room in Winnipeg, as a kind of ongoing injury that nobody outside the community is in any hurry to treat. A city of 200,000 was protected. Several First Nations communities were sacrificed to protect it. That is not a metaphor. That is the documented, official decision. The ghost town nobody wants you to find is still inhabited by the people waiting to go back. Every place on this list had a purpose once. The Prairie Store in Bent's existed because the railway existed. Bankhead existed because the CPR needed coal. Mountain Park existed because a company needed labor. They all had reasons. And when those reasons disappeared, so did the places, some slowly, some overnight, some by deliberate decision. Here is what 12 ghost towns taught me about this country. Canada is vast enough to hide its mistakes. The remoteness that makes this country beautiful is also what makes it easy to demolish a neighborhood, flood a First Nation, or buy an entire town and lock the gate, and have most of the population never notice. The places on this list were not forgotten accidentally. They were forgotten because Canada is large enough that forgetting is always an option. The town that stays with you longest is usually not the most dramatic one. It is the one where you can picture yourself having lived there, where the detail of a vintage price tag on a shelf, or a couple refusing to leave an empty island, or a family standing in a forest pointing at where their kitchen used to be, lands somewhere specific. If there is a hidden place in your province that belongs on a list like this, leave it in the comments. We are listening. And if this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribing is the thing that makes it possible to keep making them.